Hello makers, and welcome to Share Stitchery. I'm Catherine Harris. Today we're going to do a sew-along from Charmed Patterns designed by Gretchen Hirsch. It's the Lamour dress. This one was recently re-released with a couple of modifications. And when I saw this beautiful border print fabric from Minerva Crafts, I knew it just couldn't be anything but this dress. So let's get started.
Bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum ba-dum bum.
So the first thing you want to do is you're going to want to cut out your pattern pieces. Here I am matching up the border prints because I want to have some of the dress being the solid color and some of the dress being the border print. And I actually want the border print to go vertically instead of horizontally. So I'm just matching up where those pattern pieces are, laying down the pattern piece, and then I'm factoring in that seam allowance. And then I'm going to pull the other piece away so that I can cut it. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to put on the interfacing on all the pieces that require it. So that would be the facings to the sarong skirt and along the bottom edge of the skirt flounce part. So I'm just using a silk organza pressed cloth here, and you notice that I'm lifting my iron instead of pushing it. So you'll get a nice cleaner adhesion with the fusible interfacing when you do that. Next step is you're going to want to serge the edges of all of the skirt pieces that you're going to be putting together, as well as the edges of the bodice pieces. Now I'm going to stay stitch. This is step number 1 is stay stitching. So I am not going to use my interlining, but I'm going to stay stitch on the lining pieces as well as my fashion fabric. So you can see that I am going directionally, and it is important to directionally sew when you are stay stitching. And so I'm starting at the top and then I'm going to the center of the neckline here. So now we've got the pieces that we are going to interline. And so I am just going to place that on top. And I'm just using a cotton broadcloth to interline this. Silk organza is another really stable and lightweight interlining. So I'm just pinning that in place so that I can take it to the sewing machine, and I just stitched all the way around. You can hand baste these. It's just a little faster using the sewing machine. Next step is number 3 on the instruction guide, and that's to form the pleats in the center of the bodice. So you can see I've already got one done, and you're going to fold up along the 2 marks that are marked on the pattern. And I'm just going to pin that with a horizontal pin in place. And you're going to want to baste that, making sure it's within that 1.3 centimeter seam allowance. So next you are going to put right sides together, and you are going to pin the bodice together. And you're going to do the same for the lining pieces as well that we're doing for the main bodice, but for this purpose I'm just going to show the main bodice pieces on the fashion fabric. So once you've got that pinned, we're going to stitch it and press our seams open. So this is what it looks like so far. And next we are going to clip the seam allowances here. And then we're going to sew the side seams to the front bodice with right sides together. And I'm going to press the seams open, and then I'm just going to clip on this side again. The reason I clipped it in the first place was it makes it a little easier to go around the curves. So it's not necessary, but I do find that it tends to lay a little bit flatter when you do it that way. And so the front part of our bodice is looking pretty good. So next we are going to take our skirt or the top lining pieces that goes on the front bodice, like the sash piece, and you're going to pin it together with the lining and your fashion fabric. And you are going to stitch all along the tops from the marks. So you'll notice that you have some ends that are open, and then we're going to trim one of the seam allowances away as close as you can. This is where duck-billed scissors really comes in handy. So I trim that one seam allowance away, and then I'm going to clip the curves. So you notice I'm going to notch out some little triangles. This just helps it form around the curve a lot easier. And then we're going to go to the other side and we're going to clip the curves again. And then, just as we did before, we are going to take out that seam allowance here. Now, being very careful that you do not clip the rest of your garment and the fabric underneath. And so you notice I am taking away the top layer, so that's the fashion fabric layer, not the lining layer. So the fashion fabric layer is the one that we had lined with fusible interfacing, so it's going to be the thicker of the two. If I were to make this dress again, when I did the fusible interfacing, I wouldn't actually include it in my seam allowances. I would actually cut the seam allowances away so I'd have less of that bulk. So we are going to flip it right sides out, and so you notice we've got a little piece that jets out. It's nicely pressed here. That piece is what we're going to attach to the top of the bodice, hence the reason we didn't sew it. So next we're going to pin it to the bodice, and we want to make sure that the area that comes down is matched up to the notches. And I tried to fussy cut this so that it would be the same palette of colors as it went down and over, just because this sash is going through some of that border print. So I wanted it to complement it nicely and try to get a little bit more white and lighter colors near the top. So the next thing you want to match up is you want to match up the center front and the dip in the sweetheart neckline with the edge of the fabric to where we start sewing and where the fabric has already been turned under, because that's the point where we want to make the transition. So we're just going to pin that in place. And I tend to use a decent amount of pins because I don't want it to move. It's very important that you have it placed correctly. Next thing I line up is our front seam here. And when I'm pinning, I'm also making sure that I'm pinning through the sides of the seam allowances that have been pressed open, because I don't want the seam allowances to get caught and folded under. So once that's all done, we're going to take it to the sewing machine and just sew the top portion here. And so you can see it's attached nicely in there. And then we're going to stitch the bottom section. So now that that's all done, our sash is completed. Now it's optional to include the sash. I just think it gives it a nice little sarong portion here. So now the rest of the bodice pieces here, we have the back bodice. So we're going to put those together just on the side seams and press those open. And so you can see pattern matching. Yes, I fussy cut that. I'm actually pretty proud of that leaf. It looks like it's part of the pattern. And then we're going to attach both of these side panels to our front bodice pieces. I'm still using the same seam allowances of 1.3 centimeters here. And we're going to press that open, and now we have our bodice done here. We'll do the same for the lining. Next up are the straps. Now I cut my straps significantly narrower than the pattern had. They were just really thick and I didn't think it would be flattering on my frame. So I cut them probably about half the thickness. And then you just sew in a tube, flip the tube right side out here. This one I just do with my fingers because it's a larger tube here. And then we're going to press it flat. And then we are going to run basting stitches. You can either do it by hand or by machine. I do 2 layers of them. And then you're going to pull those basting stitches as tight as they will go. So we've got some nice ruching going on. And then I just tie the tail ends together just to secure those. Next, we are going to attach the straps. And so because the way that I fussy cut my dress, I have a pattern strap and a not pattern strap, more of a white strap. So the pattern strap is going to go on my left side here, your right, and I am going to pin that in place, and you're pinning right sides together and making sure that the strap is hanging down, because when you flip it back up, you want the strap to be enclosed. So next, you're going to pin the other side of the strap, and it matches up with the side seams at the back, but there are markings on the pattern to tell you where to put the straps. One thing, if you do up a muslin, just make sure that you've got the right length in the straps, because taking it apart after you've sandwiched everything together can be bothersome. So you've got a couple of different options with boning. So you've got the steel boning, which is absolutely fantastic. It goes into these little cases that are pre-made, and you just stitch the cases on and you put the steel boning in. It flexes. It is my ideal choice when I'm making like a couture wedding gown. So you'll see here, I have the like nylon plasticky version of the boning. So I actually decided to go with this for this dress. It is a beachy dress. So number one, I wanted it to be able to flex with me and not be necessarily as rigid. So it's a bit more comfortable, but still had that structure in there of the boning. And number two, I wanted it to be washable, because with the steel boning, even though it's stainless steel, if you wash it and it gets wet, it has the potential to rust. And so even when you're taking it to the dry cleaners, you need to let them know that there is steel boning inside your garment, because they can't use certain processes even at the dry cleaners with that. So you can see here at the ends, after I've clipped them, I just used a heat source, that being a candle, to melt the ends so that they are not sharp. And the nice thing about this one is you can actually stitch right through it with a zigzag stitch. So I'm just measuring my seam allowance. So my seam gauge here is showing me what my seam allowance is going to be, and I'm going to make sure that it is below that seam allowance. That's very critical, because you don't want that boning poking up into the seam allowance. And so I'm actually just stitching it directly on. It doesn't need any casing. And I checked again at the bottom. Now the bottom is crucial because you want to stop at your waist. So you notice that I have a lot of extra fabric at the bottom from where my boning stops, because this type of boning doesn't bend. It will create these weird kinks. So you want it to stop at your waist or where you're doing the bending. Okay, so now that we've got the boning in the lining, and you can see that's going to be the inside. It looks quite nice. We are going to take our fashion fabric and we're going to sandwich them together. So we're going to put right sides together with the fashion fabric, making sure you pull down the straps and that they do not get caught in the sandwiching. If you're worried about the straps, you can pin them down underneath. And so I am just going here and I'm lining up the seams. And before I pin, I'm flipping it over to my lining side. Now the reason that I'm doing that is so that I can better see where things are going to match up, because I want to stitch on this side of the fabric. And you'll notice that when I'm pinning, I pin at all of the side seams and princess seams first, because I want to match those up. And then I add pins in the middle. And this helps you to align all the seams so it looks beautiful. So next, I am going to put in where my seam allowance is. So that's the 1.3 centimeters on the left side of your dress. And then on the right side of your dress, you are going to have the lapped zipper. So you want to have a larger 1-inch seam allowance on that end. And so you're flipping the fashion fabric over by the 1 inch. And then on the lining, you are going to have a slightly smaller seam allowance. And we're just going to pin that in place. And now we are going to stitch all along the top. So you take it to your machine, making sure you backstitch on this because it is something that can get a bit of wear. Now what we're going to do is we are going to clip some notches in here to help to turn it. So number one is our sweetheart neckline definitely needs a notch to be able to turn that and to get that nice heart shape. There's a bit of bulk here at the seam allowances. So what I'm doing on the lining side is I'm actually clipping down the seam allowances. And so similar to what we did on all the other ones, we are just going to trim that down as close to the seam allowance as we can get. And this will really help with turning and creating that crisp edge. So I'm going to flip it to my fashion fabric side and I'm going to do some notches. And just clipping out some little triangles here, making sure that you do not hit your stitching, but getting as close to that stitching as you can. And this notching creates some ease in the fabric so that there's not as much puckering. So we're going to flip that right side out. And just look at the seams a little bit, making sure everything looks good, that there's no puckers, turning out that lap for the zipper. Okay, so next we are going to open it up and we are going to do some understitching. So that means we're going to press all the seam allowances to the lining side, and then we are going to stitch very close, probably about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch away from our seam allowance on the lining side. So you'll have a row of stitches on the lining side that you can see right here. And what that does is it helps to keep everything pressed in place. And so that your lining doesn't start poking through and popping up while you're wearing it. Now we're on to the skirt pieces. So what we're going to do is we are going to make the darts for the skirt. So your darts are marked on your fabric. So you want to do it in both your fashion fabric and your lining fabric. I'm just showing the fashion fabric right now. So my preferred method for doing the darts is I mark them and then I actually put the pins through along the lines of the dart on both sides, so I know that I'm getting it even on there. If you're not as comfortable just pinning, what you can do is you can hand baste the darts to make sure that they are in place and then stitch them. So I do backstitch at the top here. That being said, when I get to the end, I do not backstitch. So what I've done here, I'm just going to lift my needle up, lift my presser foot, pull my threads away, and then I'm going to cut my threads. And I've got this tail. Now it isn't secured by a backstitch, but what we're going to do is we're going to tie the thread tails. This eliminates the bulk at the point of a dart. So if you ever have difficulties pressing a dart and it's got like little bubbles and it's just puckering and it isn't as smooth as you'd like it to be, you can barely see where that dart was. That's what you're going to want to do. And so you're going to press the darts and you press them towards the back center seam. So right here I have some interfacing. I always interface my zippers. And so I press that. You want to give a little added stability with the zippers. It is an area of tension on the garment. And so I would always suggest, even if it doesn't include it in the instructions, to interface where the zipper is going to be. So next we are going to do the back center seam, but we're only going to do it from the notch to the bottom because we want to leave the one edge open to insert our lapped zipper. So what you're going to do there is you're also going to create a notch and then press the seams open. Next we have our skirt front. And we're going to place it right sides together, and we are going to stitch the side seams. So a little recap, I do have everything already pre-serged. You can finish it using your preferred method. If you don't have a serger, you can use a zigzag machine, but I just like to make sure that the edges are finished and nice and neat. So once that's stitched, we have our skirt front and skirt back together. You notice the one edge of the skirt front is for our ruffle. So it's got that big long piece on the end. So I did press the seams open. So these are all of the pieces for the facings to our ruffle piece. So I just cut them out of my fashion fabric. You could cut them out of a contrasting fabric so that you had a pop of color when the ruffle would show, because it does blow in the wind, which is lovely. So I'm just pinning the edges together, and I'm just going to join them in a long chain. So you can see I've got that one piece done. And then I'm going to add on the next piece of the facing. And on these, I have fusible interfaced them, as well as serged the top edge, not the bottom edge, because that bottom edge right there is what's going to attach to the skirt. So we don't actually need to serge that one. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to lay those facings on top of the fashion fabric, matching the points. And you can see that the serged edge is the one that's facing the inside of the skirt, and then along the edge that I'm pinning is the non-serged edge. And also, in hindsight, after doing this, when I did the fusible facings, what I would do is I would use a lighter weight fusible interfacing. This one was a lightweight one, but I tried to find one that's a little bit lighter. I did find that it was rather stiff on the flounce, which is something that I didn't like. It almost had like a starchy texture to it. So I would try to find interfacing that is slightly lighter. As well, I wouldn't have extended the fusible interfacing into the seam allowances. That's something that I would have cut away. There we go. So now we're going to flip it right side out. And you can see the skirt right here. And then we've got our flounce that just wraps around the front here. So you've got the nice little gathers. And what I'm doing here is I am going to baste the top of the sarong skirt to the front of the regular skirt pieces. That way it stays in place. So when we're stitching the skirt bottom to the bodice, we're not going to have any shifting or moving. So I just did a row of stitches here to hold everything in place. Next, we are going to hand stitch the bottom of the sarong skirt facings to the skirt itself. Now you could do this by machine. Personally, I like the look of a hand basted skirt facing as opposed to machine basted, because you can make the stitches go a little bit further apart. And when you stitch in this manner, which gives you kind of a series of like V's or W's, it is a very secure stitching method. I do double up my thread on this, so I'm not using a single layer of thread. I do use a double layer of thread. You catch a little bit in the top of the skirt, and then you catch a little bit in the facing, and you just keep going back and forth in that zigzag motion all around the skirt hem. And then you press it, and this is what the skirt facing looks like on the inside, nice and crisp and clean, and on the outside, barely visible. Okay, so now we're going to attach the skirt bottom to the bodice top, and we're only doing it through the fashion fabric layers right now, so not the lining layers. And so I've got that stitched, and that's my bodice lining. Next is onto the zipper. So I'm just getting out my seam gauge here because I want to double check the seam allowances on that. So now we're going to insert the lapped zipper. So we actually insert it on the folded edge here. So I'm just going to pin that in place. And I'm just doing it through the fashion fabric layers right now. So you want to make sure that you're not catching the lining in this. So I do that all the way down, and then I'll stitch the zipper in place on both sides. So this is with the zipper in place. So a trick that I've learned with a lapped zipper is actually taking tape. Masking tape works a little bit better than the Scotch tape, but all I had on hand was the Scotch tape. So what I'm doing is I'm taping it down, and it actually gives me a line where I can do the stitches on the lapped portion of it. So we've got the one side put in on the zip, and now we've attached where the lap is going. And so I am stitching through all the fabrics into the zipper by attaching the lap. And so the lap zipper is something that was quintessential 1950s. You see that in the vast majority of the garments is how they finished off their zippers. So the last thing that we are going to need to do is do the hand stitching for the inside. There you have it, the Lamour dress by Charmed Patterns. All in all, this pattern is a fantastic make, and I would say it's geared more towards a intermediate advanced. It has a number of couture techniques and has fabulous instructions on how to do it. So I think that it would be great for a beginner sewist. And I've also noticed that a couple of those techniques remind me a lot of Alison Smith's couture techniques. She has a fantastic book, I'll link it in the description down below, that you can learn in even more detail some of those techniques. That being said, with the Charmed Patterns, it was always Gertie's inspiration that you make each dress uniquely yours. And so one of the things that I decided to do with my Lamour dress is to add a very cute little bow at the top on the back closure, because let's be honest, it wouldn't be a Catherine Harris without a cute little bow. That being said, thanks so much for joining in today. Please hit that like and subscribe button down below, and I would love to see your makes and your take on this dress. And if you have any questions for me, please leave it in the comments down below. Now, if you want to check out some of my other works and follow along with what I'm doing, you can check me out on Instagram at Sheer Stitchery. I can also be found at my Etsy store, also at Sheer Stitchery. And I've got a website that you can sign up to my newsletter at www.sheerstitchery.com. Thanks, and we'll see you next time. Bum